1990s, critics have been reticent to identify significant trends in photography. Back in 2000, we certainly did witness the cresting of certain schools or movements. This is not to say, of course, that the powers that be who do arbitrate on these matters have reneged on their promise, nor the platforms have disappeared, as there exist now even more regular platforms such as MoMA's New Photography, our own Deutsche Börse Photography Prize, and many photography biennales. But what seems to be missing is the impulse to codify a new set of common principles. Why might this be so? One might conclude that this mode of thinking has become déclassé. In the art world, in an art world that values pluralism and interdisciplinarity, perhaps medium-specific concerns and the impulse to group artists together have given way to a more expanded notion of art production, in which somewhat paradoxically the individual tends to take precedence over the group. So how then best to talk about what's been happening over the last few years? In the brief time available, I'll restrict myself to making a few propositions about just a few of the many interesting positions and changes that have taken place. What interests me about them is that they operate within a set of terms that diverge from those usually used to understand the medium. And what I mean by that is that the institutional discourse around photography remains encumbered by a number of conventions which are tied to a specific reading of photographic history concerned with the camera's status as a tool used to depict states of things in the world. This history revolves around confirming or exploring Barth's assertion that the medium's essence is the ability of the photograph to testify that which has been. Inextricable from this history is the idea that photography acts as a window on the world, a transparent glass through which we see images. And this tends to repress several integral aspects of the medium, such as its physical support and numerous decisions made by the photographer in capturing the image. So the new, still inchoate approach, which we at the Photographers Gallery have been exploring through a series of shows linked by themes, these themes being photography and sculpture, photography and collage, photography and architecture and drawing, is one that speaks of photography's repressed aspects around the idea of the different types of support that hold the image and techniques used in its creation. The type of work incorporated into these new approaches moves photography away from being a conduit through which images are channeled towards an idea of photography as a medium whose specific properties can be stretched and placed in dialogue with other media. So the work of this new generation falls into those whose experiments overlap with painting, collage, sculpture and drawing. And so, just to move on quickly to photography and painting, of course, we all remember that at the beginning of the discussion, but in recent years, we've seen a resurgent interest in lensless techniques and the work of Walid Beshti, Liz Deschênes, and Alison Roster, just three examples I give, and digital imaging software that move photography into relationship with painting, which is very different and less concerned with rivalry than it is with the creation of a dialogue or a space in which the two media can intermingle. Beshti here on the top left-hand corner produces photograms that he calls blind drawings because he produces them in the dark room, without a camera and exposes them to different colours. He's interested in the generative aspects between the image and the object, how images are produced, because he considered images to be very immaterial, and he's much more interested in the performance of the darkroom in creating these images by chance. Liz Deschênes, an American artist, on the right up the top, is here represented by her 2013 installation at the Whitney Biennale, which is a series of photographs exposed outside, not inside the darkroom, to ambient light, and so which record subtle variations in tone. And finally, down the bottom, the two images down the bottom are by the New York-based artist Alison Rossiter, who I recently included in an exhibition I did for the Rencontre Arles. And she is quite fascinating because she uses expired photo papers that she sources off eBay to produce cameraless images by simply dipping her work in Developer. And she allows the inherent character of a paper to talk to her and respond with either found photograms or these dipped painted works. However, there are other contemporary artists who don't have such a direct lineage. They engage us with a photograph's surface not as a physical support upon which painting-like gestures can be made, but as a field of pixels where painterly marks can be simulated. One of the two artists I'd just like to draw your attention to is Sam Falls. In this image, we see him addressing digital photography as a virtual canvas, but these works really are the result of a multivalent process that combines the original analogue image, which is subject to digital manipulation, and then painting. The other artist who is very similar in a way to Sam Falls, and is often in conversation with him, is Lucas Blacklock, who also makes painterly use of Photoshop in some of his works. But rather than virtually painting on top of the image as Falls does, he paints with the pixels that comprise the image, so reconfiguring rather than adding or overlapping. So photography is less rarely talked about in terms of its relation to sculpture, except as a method of documentation. However, recently there's been an emergence of studio-based photography geared especially to still life, which I have found very exciting. And there's been a noticeable move away from the utilitarian view towards photography used as a site in which a type of sculptural activity can take place. And the key idea is the use of the frame as a box in which the world is arranged, as opposed to the analogue model of the window through which the world is viewed. Elad Lasries serves as an emblematic example as he foregrounds the framing of his image with custom-made lacquered frames, which have these glorious colours, which always match the colour of his images, and they're very small in scale and just very covetable objects. Whether his own images or those that he appropriates, he never makes clear, but they always exude a similar feeling of being fully integrated objects, not just images in frames. And then finally in this section, there's an artist called Owen Kidd, who was, in fact, Jeff Falls' assistant, and you can see that, I think. And he produces something called a durational photograph. Apart from these being beautiful images on the wall, there's always an element in these that move very, very slowly, but it's just extremely, one object will move extremely slowly, 360 degrees, and in this object here, it's the white element on the top left-hand corner, like the lamp, that moves extremely slowly, 360 degrees, over a period of 1.5 minutes. But you don't even notice it really. You have to be looking very, very hard at them. These are his own words about his work. It reveals the possibility of two types of time, one that is frozen and one that is always mobile. I'm trying to reverse the typical effect of the still photograph, to ask people to think about creating stillness out of duration. It's a performance of photography that I don't think occurs so readily in the narrative activity of cinema. Into post-documentary photography, I've got a few people here who really interest me. Alex Soth, the American, work roughly incorporated under the title of post-documentary. This is all work which cheerfully dispenses with the burdens and issues of truth and ethical responsibility, power and authorship which freighted documentary under postmodernity. Released for better or worse, from the imperative to critical and political self-reflection, many of these photographers have turned the exploration of the other into a form of self-expression. Soth is more concerned with crafting a compelling narrative than exploring the space between himself and his subjects. And as an extension to this post-documentary work is the research-based work of Taryn Simon and Broomberg and Channeran, both of whom we've shown recently at the gallery. For both sets of artists, research is as important, if not more so, than the visual outcome of the project. Taryn Simon's project, An American Index, illustrated here on the right. This is all the waste, all the contraband that was discovered in one day in the US Customs. All the food that people take in and is then taken off them. That's one of the images from American Index, but it was a series of 60 images where she compiled an inventory of what lay hidden and out of sight in American society, exploring all aspects of religion, medicine, government, and science. And on the other side, on the left-hand side, is her newest project. It took 4 years and was called A Living Man Declared Dead and Other Chapters, in which she travelled around the world researching and recording bloodlines, family bloodlines, and their related stories. Her collection is at once cohesive and arbitrary, mapping the relations amongst chance, blood, and other components of our fate. And Broomberg and Channeran, on the right, from a work that they undertook in Afghanistan, where they travelled with the British Army without a camera, and when they arrived at the place where they had to be, where the army was to do duty, they exposed a single piece of film where they were. And it was one of the few days of the war when nobody was killed. So the piece is called The Day No One Died. And of course, here they're asking questions about the nature of foreign photographers' intervention in war zones and also the function of images during wartime. At the moment in the UK and Europe, the biggest thing that's happening is the self-publishing book phenomena. It's an acknowledgement, of course, of the importance of the photo book throughout photographic history. We only have to think of Walker Evans, Let Us Praise Famous People, and Robert Frank's The Americans to understand the importance of photography on the page. And so this younger generation is really building on that heritage. But they also, of course, now can control all aspects of the production of the book, from editing to distribution. And for them, this has given them great latitude in how they create the work. Red-Headed Peckerwood by Christian Patterson incorporates and references the techniques of photojournalism, forensic photography, image appropriation, reenactment, and documentary landscape photography. On a conceptual level, it deals with a charged landscape and plays with photographic representation. It tells a pre-existing narrative about a 19-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl who go on a killing spree over 3 days in Nebraska in 1930, all based on a true story. And it walks a very fine line in his recreation of it between fiction and non-fiction, and becomes really a meditation on the unfathomable nature of violence. And finally, somebody who's become an overnight sensation in Europe, in the UK especially, Cristina de Medel, a Spanish artist based in London, who produced a book called The Afronauts 2 years ago. And the book was based on an article she saw in the paper when she was doing some research on Africa, that in 1964, just after independence, the Zambian government announced that it was going to go into the space race. You know, it was the time of when Africa was full of gung-ho ideas and optimism. So Christina actually recreated what would have happened had the had Zambia gone ahead with its plans to put men on the moon. And this little book that was published and made available 2 years ago for £35 is now not available for anything under £2,000. So she obviously made a good call there. And the thing that interests me about these books is that they're meant to exist as photographic books. They're not meant to be ever produced as images on the wall. They're right format, the right way to read them and consider them is in book form. Because photography plays so well with narrative that often a book is the better way for an artist to present their work.
What happened to photography is such an open-ended subject, and it's great that it's being posed here as a question. I was given a similar brief quite recently in editing issue number 93 of Photofile magazine. So in putting together our special anniversary issue, I tried to embrace ACP's founding spirit. And I'd like to talk through some of the key themes and ideas that emerge specifically through a selection of the imagery here. Along with David Moore, Stacey was one of the founding figures of the ACP, and from 1973 to 1975, just as the centre was being launched here in Paddington, Stacey took off on a 2-year road trip around Australia, systematically documenting his journey with his Instamatic camera through the windscreen of his VW Combi van. The 280 photographs amassed were divided into 17 folios and arranged around the walls of the ACP in a way not dissimilar to Richet's Every Building on the Sunset Strip. For this series, Park and his partner Narelle Ortio had taken off on a 2-year road trip around Australia, similar in scope to Stacey's journey, but the results could hardly have been more different. Both with backgrounds in press photography, Park and Ortio give the sense of responding quickly and instinctively to their surroundings, which brings a dynamism and narrative verve to their work. Revisiting an archive of images across time is an idea also explored by the Sydney-based Samoan New Zealand photographer Greg Samu. Part of the Pacific diaspora that has helped revitalise the arts on both sides of the Tasman, Samu was initiated with traditional Samoan tattoo in 1994, documenting this culturally important marker of genealogy in his 1995 series Self-Portrait with Paya. The very materiality of film is the subject of Tacita Dean's commission that was presented at Tate Modern's Turbine Hall in 2011. Usually employing 16mm film, and in this case old-fashioned techniques such as aperture gate masking, and glass matte painting, Dean loves the qualities of alchemy, resistance and silence inherent in the analogue medium as opposed to the digital. And also she obviously loves the looming, she's very drawn to the looming obsolescence which she laments in this large-scale work. Natasha frames her discussion around two exhibitions, 1970s Photography into Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art and this year's Image into Sculpture at the Pompidou. And she says that this change in terminology from photography to image says much about the way the medium is now understood through an expanded field of digitalisation and proliferation. Simon Denny's sculptural work from the Pompidou show, and it's called Seven Drunken Videos Stupor, which is a good title. And it symbolises the drowning or disappearance of the analogue image, and it underscores the stupefying changes in technology that bring forth these images into the world. Natasha ends her essay with a recent installation by the Icelandic artist Ronnie Horn. In this work, Horn places her light-sensitive solid cast glass sculptures next to the windows, allowing them to change colour and hue according to the atmosphere and weather outside. Nearby, Horn presented photographic topologies of a face, reflecting subtle changes similar to those of the glass sculptures, and offering a potent metaphor for the process of photography itself, one which is rarely still and ever-changing.
For me, it's very much about, photography is very much about the image and the making of the image. So we can look at a whole range of the ways that photography appears in the world. I'm very interested in the way we actually look at contemporary politics and the way the image is utilised in contemporary politics. This is probably one of the game-changing images of this century. So it was also, like a Krugson, it was actually an installation, an event, there was an event that happened, but radically these people started the event and then we recorded the event. People are using the photographic medium, people are using imagery to pursue photographic evidence and pursue political dialogues. This radical notion of suicide and political events and death coming through suicide started me looking and working in the Middle East, which I've been doing for at least the last 10 or 12 years. This is research of martyrdom soldiers from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and here you actually see evidence of the photograph as memorial, the photographic image as memento mori, and objects that have been put into these positions where they are almost like little installations. The ideas of the martyrdom as well. So here you have mosaic images. This is the past leader of Hezbollah, and this is the object. This is the car that his family and he were blown up in, and then the blown up refuse becomes an object, and the object was taken to a mausoleum that they built. I love this quote from George Alexander, who's a great essay writer in Australia and a friend. He says, did you come by car, or did you come by plane, or did you come by photography? In Shia Islam, there's notions of the hidden imam, and the hidden imam is someone that will come, that will appear at the end of days. And here we actually have Nasrallah. He does not appear in his rallies so that he doesn't get assassinated, for one. But two, he's actually utilising this idea of the hidden imam, and he's hidden from his followers, but he actually appears via the lens. All the rallies, he actually comes to the rally via photography. And then you had these sort of photographs where the icon is, there's a head floating in space, just like you would see the apparition or the icon of traditional iconic paintings out of Christianity. These ideas of this sacred garden, so they're always promises with the martyrdom idea that you are going to a better place, you are going to paradise, you are going to these sacred, secret gardens. But here's an example of work in Oman, where you actually came and you come along very sort of hot day, 50 degrees days, and you're driving along these very deserted roads, and you actually come along, you can only see a part of this fort, but what you see is a fort. And the fort is constructed in such a way in the landscape that you have hills and a fort, and the whole garden is secret. You can see nothing until you enter the fort, and when you get under the top of the fort, you actually have this whole paradise opened up to you. What we're really in now, in post 9/11 world, is that we're actually not in the war of the fog of war. We're actually in a war of the image, where we actually have the fog is the war. We are being fogged by war, and we're being fogged by the media, by dialogue, by propaganda, by a whole range of people that want to discuss their point of view with us. So we are in this idea of we're in the war of the fog. Coming out of that, I was making these works that are looking at martyrdom, looking at the iconography, and these images are roses that I grew and then I documented over time, and they would be in fog machines and smoke, and the image would slowly arise out of the fog, and these ideas of the garden and this image would slowly evolve out of these fogs, and you would actually see embedded notions of what's going on in terms of martyrdom, iconography, the war of the image. Embedded in some of these images around the edges there, you'll actually see faint traces of predator drones. And so these drones are actually making martyrs of people that are innocent or guilty. And you also see surrounding the sacred garden, surrounding the Islamic part of the Islamic world, are the drones on the flower, and embedded around that and within that is the Islamic motif. So playing with ideas of the way that these things start to operate. This is the landing site in Gallipoli from the water, and you actually coming out of the water, coming onto the land. So I'm also interested in the way that the land operates as this biographical notation. So geography and geography is the writing of country, the writing of the landscape. So I'm very interested in the way that the landscape writes its history as well. For us, for Australia, this is a very embedded site. This site is rich with the whole of our Australian traditions and mythologies and aspirations around mateship and looking after your mates in times of trouble, and all of those things that we know about that are embedded in Gallipoli. When we move into southern Syria, this is a site in southern Syria, the biography of the country is really laid bare. What you see here, in one space, we have the Bedouin, then we have Nabatean, then we have Greco-Roman surpassing the Nabatean, and then from the Greco-Roman we actually have on the hill up the top here, that's a Crusader castle, so the Crusaders came through. Then on the other hill you have a big tower, and that tower is the Ba'athist regime, the Syrian army outpost. So you actually have in the one site, all at the same time, collapsing time and history and space. So you can actually stand in this one site and see all of that history all at the same time. Jumping to Aussie landscape, this is out of Balgo, so we can look at Indigenous traditions of inscribed and notions of country in Australia, and counteracting that with ideas of Balgo at the top, red country, western desert, all the inscribed ideas that we know about in terms of Aboriginality and context of culture. And down the bottom here, we actually have Nebo, Mount Nebo. So you actually have Moses telling the chosen people, this is your promised land. Well, this is the spot where he said it, allegedly. So we're looking at a country, we're looking into Jordan, into Israel, into the promised land, and then I like this sort of juxtaposition between who's promising what and where and how, and the stories related to country. Jumping into Aleppo, this is northern Syria now. So this landscape no longer exists. This landscape has been decimated, it's been bombed to pieces. And in the same space, only about an hour away, you have a Byzantine village. So this is a Byzantine village from the 6th century. And now if you go back, you'll actually see the Byzantine village of the 6th century and the Aleppo of the 21st century are now starting to look the same. So I'm really interested in the way that history echoes. So I'm really interested in particularly in these sort of spaces, Byzantium. In Byzantium, they actually had this wonderful thing which predicts photography, which I think is wonderful. And the idea was the image is not made by the human hand, which I love that idea, that the photography is not made by the human hand. These paintings were said to be made not by the human hand. And when the artist painted them, they weren't painting with their brush. God was moving through them and painting the painting for them. So there's a miraculous image happening, and the image would just appear via the vessel of the painter. The recent work I've been doing is looking at this idea of the submerged history and the echo of history, and working underwater and working with gold pigments and things that are floating out of that water, dropping through the surface, breaking the surface, and looking through. These are all objects from my father's house in Alexandria in Egypt, and there are all these objects that were disappearing when he had to leave, and what's happening now. It sort of starts to echo these ideas of loss of memory, loss of culture, and the evisceration of various cultures that are happening through the region.